All right, Viv, why don't you just start off by telling us what attracted you to complexity and what called you to help individuals and organizations to understand it better?
Well, when I first started in the world of work, I didn't know it was called complexity. I was just drawn to working in making sense of the world of work, having the world of work be a better place for people. I started my life actually as a social work degree, but it became very clear that the bureaucracy and I didn't actually have a very good fit. And in my final year at university, I discovered a industrial relations course. I discovered Professor Bill Ford and did industrial relations in my final year, and that took me on a fairly right-hand turn. And Bill saw industrial relations as a sociological event rather than a legal event. So I got involved with teaching industrial relations, studying industrial relations. And so my early world of work for me was all about what made things in the workplace tick and how could it be a better way of people and work. It was only later that I understood that what I had the fortune to be involved with was a whole lot of natural complexity workers. In those days, we called them Mavericks, or people who were prepared to challenge the status quo and do things differently. And in the 70s in Australia, there weren't very many women involved in the world of industrial relations. And I was fortunate enough when the Labor government got elected in the early 70s, and they had a manifesto of saying there needed to be women on all inquiries. There weren't very many of us involved in industrial relations. So I got caught up in government inquiries and major change initiatives and so on, which provided a pretty fruitful platform of learning for me. So I didn't know it was called complexity at the time, but looking back now, when I met Dave and there were models and frameworks and language, I could go, aha, that actually makes sense of things that we were doing, but we didn't necessarily have it inside that theoretical framework at the time.
I always find it interesting how so many of us are on a path and you're into it, but you don't know you're into it until you read a book or you get a definition, and then you start to pull on it a little harder.
Yes. So I guess the theoretical frame came from socio-technical systems, which was coming out of Europe and Sweden. And there was a lot of work happening at that time in the OECD, but it was very focused on workplaces and work environments, as opposed to the work of Dave in knowledge management and other places. But the principles were very much the same, which was about how to understand the systems of work and social systems better, and how do you make an impact of change differently. Yeah.
And you mentioned Bill Ford was a mentor to you to get you started in this?
Bill was an interesting guy. He was a mature age student who actually came to the US and was a member of the Freedom Rides here in Mississippi. Bill was then lectured in industrial relations at New South Wales University. But he was really ahead of his time. So he was an advisor to the OECD, to the Swedish government, Japanese government, and had a view about the world of work and of change. And he coined terms like multidimensional change. I've just been looking at some of the old work that we did early as 1999. He and I were giving papers around entrepreneurial project management, how to shift the focus and so on. And we got involved in doing some pretty significant big systems change in workplace reform when there was a big change in the Australian system in the late 80s. So I started off as his student, and we ended up working together in a number of significant projects. So he died 5 or 6 years ago. But yes, it was a very important part of my life for 30, 40 years.
And as you carry on the work, I mean, we were talking at the beginning before we started recording about how systems drive behaviors. Was systems the first stop on the way to complexity thinking?
Yes, it was, because the industrial relations system, when I first was working in Australia, was very legalistic. We had over 60% of the workforce was unionised, and it was a very legalistic system controlled by rules, regulations, and so on. And so whatever change you wanted to do operated very much within what we would see as a very ordered and compliant system, if you use the terms of complexity now. We had a view of the world that was imposed, which was about equity, standardization, so one size fits all, and so on and so forth. So looking at how to implement change inside that environment absolutely had to be not about how do you change the behaviour of people, because it was about how could you shift the system to provide enough space so that different behaviour was possible before you remotely started to look at what behaviour change was required for people. And so the big system change that happened in the 80s of moving from that way of looking at rewarding people to another meant that we could then start doing some very different things around, well, what new sorts of systems, what new kinds of strategies at a systems level would then open up the space for people to behave differently. How could we challenge the assumptions about all unions are bad, or all unions are this, or all unions are that, some of the stereotypes and assumptions that were running. So that was my, the basics and the foundations from whence I came. And nothing over the last 50 years of my employment has shifted me from that being a reasonable start point. Yeah.
Making sure that the systems promote the right behaviors, effective behaviors.
Well, and are coherent. And so, for example, I see things like organisations spend huge amounts of money, for example, on we want to be customer focused. So they'll train lots and lots and lots of people in being customer focused and spend huge amounts of money on training. And then when you look at so here was the classic. I walked into one organisation and there was into the call centre, and I could see people talking on the phone, but with their other hand they were picking up a phone when it rang, and after 3 rings they'd pick it up and they'd put it down again. Because the performance requirement was answer a phone in 3 rings. Not talk to anybody, but to answer the phone in 3 rings. So they were meeting the performance objective of being customer focused by answering the phone in 3 rings. Nobody was counting how many times these poor customers were being cut off, but they were meeting the performance objective about being customer focused. Yeah? So the system was creating the most appalling number of dissatisfied customers. So it didn't matter how many hours of skills training you put those staff through, there was not going to be an improvement in customer satisfaction because the system was wrong and what they were measuring was wrong. And the measurement systems, don't get me started. Anyway, we then go to something like, let's have collaboration. Oh, yes, let's have cooperation and collaboration. And yet all of the measurement systems often are about individual performance, which are all against collaborative effort. So we have managed, only on a few occasions, to get shared collaborative performance requirements at the very top, and you have to start at the top. One organisation, we managed to put in that 60% of performance expectations of the senior team could only be met through collaborative effort with at least 3 others of their colleagues and their business units. Now, didn't that change behaviour? It didn't matter, how many hours and days and months of training about how to be collaborative and what are the skills and performance requirements and good characteristics of a collaborative leader. I mean, I can fill in more forms around that till the cows come home. But I'm not going to change unless the system says this is now what is expected. And more than that, this is now, the environment now makes it possible for you to collaborate.
So you say I'm a CEO of a big corporation, or I'm the executive vice president for sales of a massive distribution organization, and we've got high octane performing people, and we're gonna put them on these metrics, and they're gonna have so many meetings, and I'm gonna reward Viv. She's got the most meetings, she has the most capacity in her schedule, and then we get to the point where we realize that these numbers are coming back and these salespeople look phenomenal, but we're not making any sales. We're not driving any business. We're not making any customers better off. What do you say to those leaders? How do you bridge that?
It's about if you go to something like this is where I find the Cynefin framework really useful, to talk to people like that and without going to the theory. Because one of the things that I have learned to talk about is you have to monitor and measure everything that matters. Now, the numbers do matter. It does matter that I have appointments and that I see people. But it's also what is important that you understand what impact am I making. It's not just how many meetings that I go to, but the impact that I'm making and the feedback that might be getting in terms of the relational component about what I'm doing, but how am I doing it, and what influence am I leaving behind. So that would be one of the things I would say. The second thing I would say to him is, look, there's a cultural thing going on and contextual thing going on, and the sorts of things that I might do in some part of your company or with some part of your product may be very different to what's needed in a different part, either because of the nature of the product or the nature of the cohort to whom I'm selling. And so to have a standard set of metrics, irrespective of your product line or of the cohort to whom you're selling, doesn't make any sense. And so you have to be a little more nuanced than you are currently being. It's a bit heavy-handed. So I would suggest to him that there would be a way of thinking about being a little more sophisticated around the way in which, and to get a very different kind of dashboard created, because he needs to think about his very big organisation as a conglomeration of smaller groups who collect up to make his big organisation, rather than one big organisation operating as a single entity, because if he thinks about it, that's not the way the world operates. So how do we get an ecosystem going with groups who make sense in a collective that come together, rather than trying to find a single scoreboard? Now, if at that stage he's glazed over and looking and saying that's all too hard, then we part company, which happens often.
Yeah. Now, is that because I was going to say, the big giant consulting company that came in, they had all these spreadsheets and numbers, they told me that, and if that didn't work, we'll just get rid of 10%.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And you can do that for so long, and then you are either in crisis or you're being bought out.
Yeah. So for the companies that are out there that in earnest believe that, so that we talk about John Boyd on our show and our work. He had an admonition: people, ideas, technology, or people, ideas, things, or people, ideas, hardware, always in that order, that people always had to come first. So as I look over the work that you're doing, it seems to me that when you go into a company and you explore what's going on, you're getting to the bottom of what the people are thinking and the perspectives of the people, and you're measuring. You can see numbers, but get context behind it, purpose, why, what's really going on. Is that a fair restatement?
Look, absolutely. One of the things, if I go back to my history around doing this, when Bill Ford and I and other colleagues first started to tackle how do you do things differently inside and some of these were pretty toxic industrial relations environments. They had years of patterns of tense conflict and so on. How do you change those patterns? It's a very human issue, and it's deeply embedded. And I was working in environments like the waterfront, your longshoremen, mining industries, manufacturing, construction, and so on. And there were deeply embedded and deeply entrenched patterns that had been there for a very long time. But it was, at the end of the day, it was absolutely about people. And so the assumptions that we went in with were, at the end of the day, people wanted to do a good job. So that was the first assumption that we made. People didn't wake up in the morning and say, we want to come to work and be a bunch of bastards and get up each other's noses. And generally, we started with the assumption, whether they were the managing director or the guy on the line, people actually wanted to do a good job. That was assumption one. Assumption two was that there were ingrained patterns that needed to have, and in today's language we would say we had to shift perspectives and be able to show that there was another way, or many other ways, that there were options to do things differently. And so our job was to create options. And the third thing was it had to be within the environment that they were used to. So it wasn't a matter of, so much of the early work around change was throw everything out. There had to be the burning platform, that the whole world had to be different. What we knew to be true was it had to be within the world that they knew, so that there was safety in making some shifts. One of my other mentors was the late, great Charlie FitzGibbon, who was the federal union organiser for the waterside workers in Australia. And he took me aside one day and he said, listen, mate, you can't change the world all at once. A bit at a time, mate, a bit at a time. And I will always remember that, because even if you have the grand vision, for people, it's a bit at a time. And Charlie and I came up with this notion of, and it became known as the one-off, no prejudice. We get people to say, just try this once. And if it doesn't work, we can go back to the way it was. Because what Charlie and I both knew was, as soon as you got people to change just a little thing, try something once differently, it could never go back to the way it was, because you'd shifted perspective. So Charlie and I and his colleagues and a number of others on the waterfront, this is when we were introducing containerisation into the Port of Brisbane back in the 70s, rather than trying to sell the great big grand change plan and tell everybody how wonderful the world was going to be and so on and so forth, which was the fashionable change strategy at the time, we did things like just let one ship in. And depending on where it bursts, we'll have these sorts of arrangements. And then when that's done, we'll sit down and we'll work out what worked and what didn't and whether we can do it again. And we did it slow, and we got container ships into the Port of Brisbane without a single day stoppage. And it's the only port in Australia where that happened. And that was under the guidance of these guys, because I was prepared to listen, and they took this poor little young Sheila under their wing. I ended up there. How I ended up there is a whole other story. But they taught me complexity. They taught me how to do this, learning by doing, in a way that made sense. But it was always about, yes, we wanted change in the system, but the people had to be part of it right from the word go. It wasn't sitting in some back room with grand strategies and grand plans and then delivering it unto. It was always bringing it along on a step-by-step kind of basis, and that's always been part of it.
So,
and the work that was done. Sorry, go.
Oh, no, I said it sounds like you waged something of a complexity insurgency.
Yes, and I guess another, because, as I say, there were not very many women involved in this work in Australia in the 70s and 80s, and I made a very conscious decision that I wasn't going to be pigeonholed and only work in organisations or industries that were dominated by women. So my stubborn, pig-headed Irish background, ancestry, meant that I ended up very deliberately working in places like the waterfront and the mining industry and manufacturing and so on. And it was a bit of an insurgency. It was a bit different. But I was also fortunate that there were enough mavericks, people who were prepared to be trying to do things differently, that provided opportunities for me to do some interesting work and some learning by doing. And over the years, we did some stuff which was revolutionary inside a fairly traditional system.
Was a lot of it more bottom up? With
support from the top.
Yeah.
Had to have top
flow,
cover.
Kind of a flow up and down, yeah.
Absolutely. A couple of greenfield sites in the mining industry. There was a very special man called Mike Blackwell, late Mike Blackwell. This was with CRA Mining, South African. He had worked in mines in South Africa, Papua New Guinea and northwest Western Australia. And he had, there was going to be a new open cut mine in New South Wales. And he pulled together a group of us, about 5, I think, and he put us in a room for a week and said, design me a mine that's got nothing to do with the way mines are currently run. However, it must be unionised, it must meet all of the regulations. So when I sit back now, he could have been using the principles of complexity in the Cynefin framework, absolutely, but in 1970, whenever it was, we didn't have it. But it was very clearly, he gave us the boundaries, and he said, now design me a work system. And so we had a multi-skilling 4-level mine designed in 1978 and operating in Australia. For CRA. Now, most of the rest of their mines were were traditional, but it was then picked up and run by Argyle Diamond Mines and a range of others. And we ended up doing things like, instead of the traditional, very detailed behaviour codes that dominated the mining industry at the time, which, again, in complexity terms, would sit in the very ordered space of long lists of bags, what I call the bags of shoulds, what you must not do. At Woodlawn, and then was picked up by a couple of others, there was a single statement: everyone on this site will be fair, safe and honest. Now, that was signed off by everybody. Mm-hmm. There was nothing else but that single statement. No visions, no values, no things on walls of people flying and eagles and people in canoes and none of that. One single solitary statement. And the only other thing that then accompanied it was, and if you think that somebody is breaking this, this is what you do. And the guarantee was that a group would be convened within the hour of someone making a complaint to have the conversation to decide whether that had been broken, and if so, what would happen about it. And it applied to everyone. Mm-hmm. Now, the first time a group of guys raised a concern with a manager from the mill, there was a collective holding of breath to see how serious it was that the company would follow this. They were right. He was a brilliant boffin, but a lousy people manager. And because of his boffinness, he was unsafe.
You might have to translate that one for the gringos boffin in the audience.
Okay, right. Okay, boffin. He was highly technical and scientific, and so caught up. Technocrat, thank you.
Yeah, okay.
And he was so
I like
caught up with all of...
boffin better. I'm going to start using that one.
Okay, it's an Australian word. So boffin, so what that meant was he kind of forgot sometimes about the basics for people management and safety. So the end result was they made sure that he could continue to be his scientific excellence. Something else was put in place for the people management, and people and things progressed. So
sort of self-regulated?
Yeah. And what that meant in the mill was different to what it meant on the mine site, different to what it meant in the maintenance area. Uh-huh. But the principle, the operating principle was absolutely the same. Then when we picked that up and took it to Argyle Diamond Mines, now it was the first and only, I think, workplace in Australia where special legislation had to be passed that enabled random strip searching because it's a diamond mine.
Yeah.
So we had a really interesting dialogue going on. How do you make coherent, fair, safe and honest with random strip searching?
That sounds complex.
Well, it was. But what it simply meant was that we had to have a conversation about on what basis would these external security guards, what did it mean for them to be fair, safe and honest in the way they exercise their role of random strip searching?
Again, very self-regulatory, very, very organic.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the people on the site had that conversation.
What do you think when you think of these power CEOs or these power executives that have gone to all the quote unquote right schools and they have all the quote unquote right graduate degrees? What's their reluctance to experiment with these things that tap into human nature, that tap into the way people actually work and interact with each other?
It seems to me there's a couple of things from my experience. The first is that what gets taught is often a belief that what they are being taught is right, and if they only do this, then it will be so. And
if it didn't happen, then they didn't do it hard enough,
or it was somebody else's fault,
else's fault. Yeah.
There's the there's the thing of the cult of finding of copying. Whether it was, in their day, whether it was the Jack Welches or the Bill Gates or the whoever, be like these people. The case study of. There's a tendency to, here's the aspirational, if you only do this, you will be successful, you will be wonderful, you will be. I'm reminded of G.J. Dusseldorp created Lend Lease Foundation, which was one of the most successful organisations in Australia for many years, civil and civic Lend Lease and so on, and I did some work for them many years ago. And he once said to me, he said, Vivian, I am going to have to leave this company because as the founder, I find myself surrounded by incompetence and sycophants and sometimes in the same package. I am not getting honest information. So he found ways, he very deliberately found ways, including employing ratbags like me on occasions, to come in and give information that he wasn't getting honestly. Now we've got very different ways to get unimpeded information to be cut through. So I think that part of it's about what kind of information are they actually getting that is true and honest, that truly reflects what's going on as opposed to what's being filtered. Yeah, that is part of the deal. The second thing I think that I come across all the time, and even now, is who else has done it and have they been successful and prove it to me. So this fear of not being successful means that they often are not successful as they sit in the fear of not being and not being the extent to which short-term measurements for shareholder return and bonuses and so on get in the way. I'm not so sure about the American system, but in Australia we certainly don't have payoff for long-term vision. Everything's on short cycles.
Yeah.
So if you're trying, absolutely. So and the payment in terms of share prices and bonuses and so on. So if you're trying to get somebody to buy into something which has maybe got a 2, 3, 4, 5 year payoff, as opposed to a quick fix, then the people who come in with a quick fix, even if it's are going to get much more traction than someone like me who comes in and says, hey, this is going to be a longer term, but over the longer term, you're going to get bigger payoff. It's
almost like, let me come in and let me give you this pill. And that way you don't have to exercise and eat correctly and get good night's sleep and other things. So I'll just give you this very quick fix.
Which is, again, a systems issue. Now, one of the reasons why we could do so much good work in Lend Lease is because at the time it was a private company. It wasn't listed. It was a very successful company, but it wasn't listed. And so the way in which people were enumerated, the kind of things they were prepared to do. For example, Civil and Civic was their project business, and at the very top amongst the project group, project managers, if they couldn't find enough projects that their skills were needed in, then they knew it was time to leave. They didn't have to be sacked. They redundarized themselves. There's probably no such term. Mm-hmm. But as key project managers, I mean, Civil and Civic had all sorts of projects. They had to find enough work for themselves. This is at the top. This is not the subcontractors. So G.J. Dusseldorp had a whole range of very different ways. He would go on site to a project manager, and if that project manager couldn't tell him when he last had a beer with his counterpart in the union movement, couldn't answer questions about that guy's family, so that all of the relationships had been built up prior to when there was a drama, and construction at that time was pretty rough and ready in this country. 2 strikes and he was gone, because he absolutely believed in building the relationships before there was trouble, so that when there was trouble, so all of that was happening way, way before in the 80s because of the nature of the man. And it was an incredibly successful company. But that's not the thing that people wanted to see and one of the things I have always wondered is why organisations which have been incredibly successful, people will want to go to conferences, hear the case studies, even go and visit, but are very reluctant to actually pick up and do anything themselves.
Mm-hmm. You got to do the work. That we say that a lot on our show. You have to do the work, and a lot of people are averse to doing the real work. Yeah,
and they want to just copy.
Yeah.
So this country had a love affair with all things Scandinavian on a couple of cycles, and I can remember my friends colleagues from the then Swedish Institute for Working Life saying, "Do you think you could teach them how to ask the right questions?" Mm-hmm. Because all people were wanting was, give us the obvious, the rules and a copy of the papers, not understand that underneath it sits assumptions and processes and things that have to be in place in order to make it work. Mm-hmm. Wanting the quick fix.
So let's say there's a business leader out there that has taken over the helm of a company, and he or she is that maverick and says, I'm not going to have a decimation on my watch, like the previous administrations. Why don't we try something different? Why don't we try getting numbers with narratives? Talk about that. How do we connect with those companies to get those narratives that really matter? And in the end, unlock the cognitive power and the profitability and, as you said earlier, once that cat comes out of the bag, it doesn't go back in, and that's a good thing when you're unleashing the cognitive power of humans.
So there's a couple of things. If we go to the complexity principles, which is in a complex environment, you have to start with understanding the current state. And understanding the current state is about the people who are in the system telling their stories, their experiences about what's currently going on. And there's a variety of ways you can do that. And that people will include, in terms of the ecosystem, the thing that you're looking at could include customers or clients and staff, whoever it is that it might be. Now, there are ways of doing that using the software, which is the SenseMaker software, which we use, but you can also do it without the software if need be. So the first thing we do, the first stage, if you like, of any assignment we do, big or small, is the discovery. What on earth is going on around here? But we don't ever purport to say we will ever understand it all, because you never will in a complex system. You're understanding enough in order to get enough agreement to take some action to see if you're making a difference, in order to then monitor it and so on. So it becomes a dynamic kind of process. So the first thing is discovery, and there are different ways of doing it. Certainly using the software is one if you want to make sure that you collect the data and you can get feedback from the on the quantitative and qualitative data.
Well, it certainly helps direct, right? Like that certainly helps not only paint the picture and isolate where some of the challenges might be.
Absolutely. And typically when we do that, there are all sorts of insights and challenging assumptions that people have about what's going on around here. The second thing that does is it removes some of the filters, because everybody gets to see the same data and it's not filtered by anybody. And filtering is not evil. We do it all the time. We can't possibly process all of the available data.
Right.
So part of what this process is about doing is saying, let's get a shared database that is available for everybody to do two things. One is to make sense of it, but then is to make meaning. And make meaning is, well, we can make sense of this, but what does that mean for us in this context? And the context might be different if we've got, I go back to our colleague with a very big organisation. The context might be different. Or if I put it in my world, I live in Queensland, in Brisbane, but Queensland's a very big state. And what happens in southeast Queensland, dense metropolitan, is not going to be the same in the Cape, in remote Indigenous communities. It's not going to be the same as some of our regional towns or so on and so forth. So we've done some work with Queensland Health. What's going to make sense for a hospital in metropolitan Brisbane is not going to make sense for a hospital in Rockhampton or in Winton or whatever. So collecting the data about what's going on around here then allows people to say, of this data, how do we make meaning of it for what's going to be useful in different parts of the system, so that people can then take action, monitor whether it works for us, and if not, why not, and modify it and move it on from there. What it also then does is set up dashboards for immediate feedback to the decision makers so that they can track progress. And it becomes a much more dynamic change process and strategy.
So for that person that loves the dashboard and loves to see the graphics, they still get that. They're just getting better. They're still.
But the three things, I guess, that make it different, and why some people get anxious. The first is the client owns the data, not the consultant. So what that means is that for many consultants, they get very anxious about this because it shifts the power significantly to the organisation. The joy about SenseMaker as a process is that as soon as somebody puts data in, it's available. So the dashboards are immediate. It's almost real-time feedback.
Oh, yeah.
And the power, again, goes to the organisation. Now, that I see as a real value. Some organisations stop us from doing the projects because we can't guarantee. For example, one CEO said to me right at the last minute, but you can't guarantee me enough positive stories, so I'm not going to do it. Okay?
Yeah. They didn't want to hear the negative mismatches.
And they don't want to. So if you don't want to know what's really going on, if you want some sanitized version, then go a different place and space. Yeah. It absolutely is about transparency. It's about being able to do things fairly immediately and feedback on an ongoing basis.
Yeah.
And then what it permits people to do is to have the portfolio of measures. Mm-hmm. Yes, you've got the hard, typical measures of inputs and outputs and outcomes and so on, but you can also measure impact. Yeah. And what complex systems need is impact over time and literal things happening that you can very quickly enhance or shut down, because what we also know is that small interventions can have lots of unintended consequences. Wow. And you need to be able to monitor them really, really quickly, so that you know, which if I circle all the way back round, which is what Charlie FitzGibbon taught me on the waterfront. Mm-hmm. Little things often, because you have to be keeping an eye on what's happening, because if it starts going pear shaped, mate, you got to get in there quick. Right? Fabulous, right? Yeah. So it's like understanding your environment so that you do things not in some sort of idealized 7 steps to nirvana change strategy, that you're actually working with the people.
Yeah, and that's what I love about it. I mean, you're working, that's the best part about it, and you're helping them improve, you know?
Well, the learn by doing means that the people, you're doing capacity, all of the buzzwords of capacity building and empowerment and all that stuff, it happens as you're doing it.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen, it's not separated out from it, it's part of it.
Yeah, like we would say it's how we co-create value together with with a company and a client, you know, that they're the hero of the story, and we're going to help them write that story as best as they can. And what you use, the term that we use a lot, that's right out of the mouth of John Boyd, challenge all assumptions. And he said that if we don't challenge all assumptions, what becomes doctrine today will become dogma forevermore. And
yes.
you're in a lot of trouble. So this is I was just going to say, we're doing things like this, and we're extracting narratives, and we're focusing on people, ideas, things in that order. Something like SenseMaker unlocks a lot of that power and that co-creation of value that permits us to challenge assumptions that everybody should benefit. Leaders should hear not only good news, right? I mean, they should get the negative news. Otherwise, they don't know where the gaps are, right?
It's about being realistic and saying this is the way the world is. The world isn't all happy-clappy. One of the things that was really interesting in my early days of using SenseMaker, and I've now been using it since its first inception. Yeah. I will have done, and in a couple of environments, one was a particularly difficult industrial environment in the electricity industry, and I was called in because the unions and management had not been able to workers and management had not been able to sit together in the same room without a full-time official for 10 years. So I was called in by the Industrial Commission to help in the environment, and we used SenseMaker to do a culture audit. And the resistance from management was, we'll only get negative stories. Mm-hmm. And I said, you're wrong. In my experience, what we will get from the shop floor will not all be negative stories. And I would like to challenge your assumption. And anyway, they couldn't stop me because I got the approval from the Industrial Commission to do it and from the unions. And I was right. In my experience, you don't get all negative stories. That is the filter through which the assumptions of management imposed on the shop floor. Of course, there were some people who were anti, but at the end of the day, my assumption is that the people want to do a good job. They're frankly paid off at the stuff that from their perception gets in the way of them doing a good job. Now, whether that perception is right or not, that's a whole other ballgame.
Yeah.
That's what needs to be dealt with, is the perception about, in today's complexity language, the perception about whether the constraints are or are not appropriate, getting in the way, whether that, all of that stuff. It's not, but we need to change the way in which the engagement happens. Right. So we ran the sensemaker twice, and the thing got sold on. But it is my experience that the level of negativity is never as bad as management believes it's going to be.
Right.
But there's a whole lot. One of the things that these sorts of processes, if we've got the software, fantastic, but even if we don't, that my colleagues and I use, demonstrates is that we have got a whole bunch of assumptions of stereotypes and things that need to be cut through that get in the way of being able to engage and get to some kind of a way forward, and that's the responsibility not of the external facilitator, but of creating the environment that enables them to find the way forward for themselves that is theirs. Yeah.
I think that's really the benefit of it. And like with anything, it's kind of like an exam or a biopsy, right? As you await results, there's always going to be some butterflies or some apprehension. But if you don't get those results, how would you know how to diagnose? How would you know how to treat things effectively? Because you see these other surveys, I won't mention any names of companies, but they say, hey, we got the survey back. Boy, everybody's just fine. Everything's just great.
It's really interesting. The surveys that ask the questions, we're currently working with an organisation who is signed up for one of the traditional surveys, engage, so-and-so engage, right? The engagement stuff. And we're going to run a sensemaker sort of separate too. And it's interesting because the obsession around running this engage thing is because it's comparison and benchmarking and all of that kind of deal. But it doesn't provide context.
Right. Yeah, you think that Blockbuster thought they were the #1 video store in the world and everything was just fine. And we didn't have anything to worry about, externally or internally. But then one day it happens, It's
a both-and world. But I guess the other thing that I just wanted to pick up on, which is this, it's about shifting all of those, the external consultants, facilitators, et cetera, who for so many years have been the experts coming along to provide the solutions. The shift has to be, and this is the whole world of complex facilitation, which is one of my passions around complexity, where we become catalysts and enablers, but we ain't the answers. And one of the things that many organisations have yet, and senior people have yet to understand, is it's back to the thing you were talking about, is they have to do the work. It's not about signing the check to get somebody externally to come and write the big report and do a big, and now it's done. It is about doing the work. And so if you're really working in complexity, I think the biggest one that we ever did Dave Snowden and I and Sonia, we had 350 people in the basketball stadium in Darwin looking at the future of education in the Northern Territory. This is now some years ago. And the elapsed time of 2 days, clean sheet to 70 specific recommendations across the Carnarvon framework. Now, we knew as much about the education system of the Northern Territory at the end of 2 days as we knew at the beginning, which was zero. Our role as complex facilitators was to provide the environment to enable 350 people to engage with data and each other and so on and so forth to go from discovery through sense-making, meaning-making, insights and agree action. Our role is not to be saying, look at us, aren't we clever? We know what it is that you need to do and we can write the report.
Right.
And it's a whole different mindset shift for which it's not just the companies are resistant. My goodness, so are the consultants and facilitators.
Yeah, because they don't want to co-create value, or they're afraid that they're not the heroes of the story.
Absolutely. Their ego won't get out of the way either.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that the other beautiful thing about understanding complexity and working in this space and working this with companies is the fractal nature of it. So as you say, I could do it with a very small group of 6, 60, 600, 6,000, 60,000. It scales.
Yes, it does.
And I did borrow those numbers from your work. I did.
Okay.
I did my homework. I did my prep.
Oh, well, there you go. And that's
I
fine.
could have said
yes,
5 or 50 or 500 or 5,000, but I wanted to be authentic to complexability.
Okay.
So,
that's fine. No problem.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
No, I mean, that's the power of it. I think when you're sitting down with a leader and you're helping them understand that these principles are timeless, they're universal, they're fractal. They work, but they also require you to do the work, and they also require. Dave has used the term lessons learning, not lessons learned. You have to keep learning, and you have your teams and the people that you lead. They have to continue to learn as well.
Absolutely. One of the projects I was I'm most proud of is a few years ago, again here in Queensland, and another Maverick was in charge at the time of a government department who had some money to do something new for the first time. Now, and of course it has to be evidence-based. You've heard the term, I'm sure. In government, it always has to be evidence-based to make sure that you're right. Yep. So if it's got to be evidence-based and you're going to do it for the first time, typically what would happen, you then go and look at all sorts of other jurisdictions to get what they've done and pick it up and move it across. Now, this CEO had worked with me long enough and was understanding complexity. He finally, after a long time, convinced our finance department that we should be able to do innovation in context, i.e. apply the principles of the Carnarvon framework and complexity and do up to a dozen or 15 little experiments about this particular government initiative program, and that we would attach to them action learning people. They're all of the principles in terms of who would get funded, and only those that succeeded would get ongoing funding. Now, one of the initiatives, which we all thought was brilliant, was closed after 3 months because no clients came. But nothing ended up on the front page of the local newspaper about wasting money or any of that kind of stuff, because the agreement about what success would look like was set up the front. Lessons learning, we attached action learning people to the project all the way through. Yeah. The agreement about, and so on and so forth. Now, have we been able to repeat that? No, because it was all a bit too frightening for a bunch of bureaucrats. He moved on in total frustration. But it's the application of complexity principles par excellence. That innovation in context, it's cheaper to do it than all of the other stuff. And it's far more politically, it's politically safer to do it. But yes.
I think, isn't it interesting that, you could be dismissed as a teacher of complexity or, a complexity facilitator, and you get dismissed by the leaders that know it all, that went to all the right schools, that have all the right degrees, and they know everything, and they subscribe to whatever, and they know.
Yeah.
And boy, wouldn't it be interesting? You say, okay, well, fine, but what if your competitors understand complexity? And what if your competitors are doing these sorts of things, extracting narratives for their people, and they're finding out what's really going on? What's the competitive advantage that leaders need to be aware of, that things like understanding what complex adaptive systems even are, and what sense making and economic framework even is, the competitive edge that it gives you.
And I think what's interesting is, in my experience and working with this stuff now, since I met Dave, which was 2000, but even before that, the early take-up of this work was always in the not-for-profit space. A few Mavericks, many of whom have now gone, certainly in the Australian environment. In the private sector, occasionally banks, and Dave will say pharma, and again, we've had some work in the pharmaceutical world. I think post-COVID, there's probably now a range of people who are starting to get a bit, certainly in Australia, what COVID demonstrated is the fragility of the global supply chain, and a range of other things, and people are starting to have to do some radical rethink of strategy and approaches. But at the end of the day, I don't see yet in this country sufficient recognition that they have to really radically rethink. There's maybe the beginnings of that. I think until we know what's going to happen with the current financial crisis, maybe there's people's are diverted in other places and spaces. I see. It seems to me there's a couple of areas where we're likely to get significant take up. I would hope that what we could at least do is run, which again in the past we've done, is run it parallel to the more traditional systems. So rather than either or, it's both and. So some years ago in one of our big banks here, who were obsessive at that stage about lean, it's moved on, I know. By the way, my dear friend Bill Ford used to say, lean, mean and hungry equals starved to death. You know, if you keep being lean, you've got no reserve skill capacity. You can't take up opportunities. You end up outsourcing everything, including your knowledge. But there's a way of running some of these things in parallel. Yeah. So that I'm reminded when one of their big initiatives went pear-shaped on the day, and there was going to be the traditional investigation of what went wrong, and instead we ran a one-day lessons learned at the time, a one-day lessons learned using Canavan and complex processes, and at the end of the day had this is what we will do next time to do differently, as opposed to the 3-month witch hunt, which shifted the whole. So the other thing I would say, Mark, that I have learnt around this stuff is more often than not, I get success by saying to an organisation, give me 15 people and half a day and a complex issue, and let me show you what I can do. And if at the end of the day it's got no value, let's part friends.
Love that.
Because there is no way I can explain it in any way that makes any sense and resonates at all most of the time. I have never won a tender because either they don't know, they don't understand, or it's too hard or it's too scary.
Yeah.
And that's in umpty years of it. But what I do know, we've done a lot of work when I've said to, so one of the big pieces of work we got for a university who was going to go through a huge amount of a big change. And there was a person there who knew some of this stuff and was having great difficulty with the Vice-Chancellor. And I said, look, just ask him for 15 of his senior people and me for half a day, and I won't charge. I'll run a process which includes doing some stuff and mapping it onto the Cynefin framework and so on. And if at the end of the day he doesn't think it's going to add value, let's part friends.
Mm.
At the end of 3 hours, he said, when can you start?
Yeah.
So
once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Absolutely.
Once you get it, you get
so
it.
Absolutely. The first time I saw Dave in the Cynefin framework, I left the room, I rang my father and I said, Dad, I can now explain your daughter. I know where I live and I know where the rest of the family lives, and I can now explain why it is. There's a point at which sometimes we have great difficulty. Exactly. And so one of the things about all of this is finding the way to translate, find the language, find the stories, find the examples, do it in a way that has meaning for people in their context is the greatest success that I have had over the years. And I've worked with it in Cambodia, in the Philippines, and dusty villages, in all sorts of places and spaces. And it's about getting out of our own important theory heads and getting to where the people are in their context and asking the question, what is it about where they are and what their context and their issue is, and how can I translate, interpret, rejig the language and the ideas so that it will resonate for them and make meaning and shift this thing along.
I think in a time of, if this is a time of great crisis and upheaval, this is certainly the time to really consider understanding complexity and Cynefin framework and the theories of John Boyd and other things, because those things did not get us to the point. If we're experiencing crisis, it's not because of practicing those things. we can assure you that. Absolutely.
And those who have and are finding a way out of the current difficulties are those who find their way out of their own egos, in my view.
Yeah.
And truly are able to embrace and accommodate diversity, accommodate multiple perspectives, and understand that it's not about changing people.
Yeah. What do you say? So, when you direct an executive, let's just say I know nothing of all this. I want to learn more. I mean, obviously they go to Complexability's website. They go to our podcast. They go to our company, AGLX website. What are some of your favorite maybe primers on sort of understanding these in a way that's accessible, that doesn't scare anybody, that's not too maybe overly theoretical, or could give somebody some real tangible points that they can consider and realize that I really do need to learn this stuff. Maybe maybe a book or something that you think of.
Well, one of the people that I think is fabulous, because she sits a little to the left or to the right, whichever way you want to put it. One of the things, people I get them to listen to is Alicia Gerraro. Because she talks about, and one of her recent podcasts, and I'll remember which one in a moment, because she talks about complexity and its linked to nature and so on in a way that is separate to organisations but connected to organisations, and that makes them go to a different place so they're not fighting about with their own preconceived notions about organisational design and structure and so on. So I start with Alicia. I don't start with Dave. I would start with Alicia. I then would follow with Dave.
Dave was our first guest.
I know. Hey, I know, and I know Dave really well. And I think it also depends on who I'm talking to. So if I'm talking to somebody,
the context is huge. It really does.
The context is huge. Absolutely. So some of the podcasts from Dave are also important. What I would often do, however, is ask them to talk to me first about what are the sorts of things that they are wanting to deal with. And sometimes what I will do is refer them to talk to people that we've worked with.
Yeah.
Rather than go to the theory. So if they want practice first, I've worked with, for example, Meals on Wheels here in Australia for over 10 years. Les McDonald, who's the CEO, we've done lots and lots of work with them. So if they're in the not-for-profit sector or in the social issues sector, I will give them someone like Les to talk to. Mm-hmm. So some people need a real person, they don't need the theory.
Yeah.
Some people need theory. Then I'll give them a mixture of Alicia, Dave, and a couple of things to read. Sometimes I will give them, if they're interested in SenseMaker, then the work of Palm Health Foundation, who've got the stuff up on a website, gallery walk, how the stories and so on and so forth are used, and so on. So part of it depends on context and what it is that's going to give them an opportunity to engage with what it is that they think that they want. And there's reports and those who want the theory end of it. Yeah. For many people, the scary thing about am I the first, what will happen if, all of those sorts of things, it's often talking to people other than consultants is a thing in this world is going to tip them over the edge. And in terms of SenseMaker at the moment, the angst about cyber security, of course, is currently through the roof.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's the other power of speaking with people like us and you and is about providing the context and understanding their situation, because it's not so easy just to recommend. There's some say, as you say, hey, go on and watch Dave give this presentation on Kinevin, or Ponch has a great talk about the floor system, or Viv, you were on Suzanne's podcast. You know, like I've get interviewed on podcasts as well, Intersections with Quan Collins and others. So that said, I think what that's showing is that you have to, all of us are voracious learners, and we're always learning from people, and you can't stop the learning. I mean, I think when I talked to Dave on our podcast, I probably went and bought like an extra 10 books that I, you know, but the key point is that you do have to do the learning. You do have to do the work. It's not enough to just say, Viv, give me a recipe, you know, give me a formula, and I can just step back, and it's not so simple. And that's what hopefully does not get lost on people.
Well, I think that's right. And interestingly, the other day we were asked to do a demonstration of SenseMaker to a not-for-profit here in Brisbane. And they brought along one of their board members, and he was an evaluation guy who'd been doing traditional evaluation for many years, and he arrived obviously ready to be a skeptic. And at the end of it, he said, what I can say at the moment is this is not a toy. Now, that probably was the best endorsement of SenseMaker we've had in a very long time, because he was expecting just another piece of sorry, but equivalent of a kind of a quick little survey monkey thing, yeah.
Yeah.
But what he said was, this is not a toy. This has got some real. So part of what I'm saying, and I agree with you, is that if this is not for something that you just dip in and dip out of, and you can go and read the next 5 steps to Nirvana, 6 characteristics of, 9 bits of, whatever. There's much more to it than that. And if people seriously want to engage, and one of the things that I say to people is, if you want to understand where Dave's coming from, then you have to also go and look at Gary Klein's work. You have to go and look at Alicia Geraro's work. You have to go and look at Anne Pendleton-Julian and her colleagues' work. You have to go and look at all sorts of other people. And then when you've done that, now go look at Max Boiseau. Now go and look at, and would you like the articles, the 45 articles that I have, Dave, since 2000, and then you've started to scratch the surface, because then you need to go, and then you need to, oh, by the way, would you like to, and so on. So
yeah,
this is not for the faint-hearted. However, you can also start learning by doing with some very core principles.
Yep.
And there's one of the things that Julie, my colleague, a business colleague, and I are currently working on is what's the minimum viable understanding of the theory and the principles that are needed for community activators to work with these principles. So we're working with 3 organisations, a faith-based group cohort. Mob is Indigenous, in Brisbane, grouping out of Florida in the US community group, and another in Sydney. And this is about empowering community organising people to work with their own communities using complex facilitation techniques. Mm-hmm. So we've been working with them on and off for the last few years, and we're now at the stage of saying, well, okay, if we put a resource kit together, what's the minimal viable amount of theory to practice is needed that a group of people can work with their own communities? They may have run a sensemaker, they've got some data, they're now doing insights to action stuff. So we've supported these. So yes, there's all of that, but then there's, hey, I'm a parish priest, to take an example. I've got a group in my congregation. We're facing maybe having to close down. I want to run processes differently. What do I do? How do I do it? And from our perspective, what do they need to know about complexity to be able to do it in an okay way that doesn't require the deep embedding? So that's currently what we're working on.
Well, I think what's really cool about the things that you've shared, if the people that are listening, it's multidisciplinary. It doesn't matter what industry you're in. It doesn't matter public, private. It doesn't matter profit, nonprofit. These principles are universal and can be applied everywhere. And that's another one of the beauties of understanding this. It seems like it's not too hard to convince business leaders that the world is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, right? I mean, they get it. It's harder to show them what to do about it, and the effective ways to do about it, because they generally tend to follow contagion and trend to do what everybody else is doing, but getting the same results over and over again.
There are 3 things, I think, which get in the way. One is the obsession about what to measure, and this nonsense about if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Well, okay. It's about understanding that you can measure impact. Right. It's having a different perspective about what is measurement. And if you only have a short-term perspective about measurements. So what Dave says, and what I absolutely agree with, there's measure and there's monitor. And in a complex system, you monitor. So sure, you have measurement, but you also have to have monitoring. And once you wrap your head around monitoring, then you can say to an executive, you are not losing control, because what you have got in place is a dashboard that monitors trends in a way that still gives you control over time.
Yeah. And
you don't need an external consultant to do that for you with expensive surveys every however long. You can do that in real time with a distributed sensor network of your staff and your clients and so on and so forth in a much more sophisticated feedback way than you've currently got. So one of the things is about shifting perspective around that. The second is modifying current systems of things like reporting's one, and the other is budgeting and all of the other kind of systems which currently haven't got enough flex in them to cope with the part of the system that is complex. So, for example, some years ago, I worked with an organisation where they adopted the principle that said, let's look at those things which we know sit in the ordered space, and then there's 30% of the budget will be totally unallocated, and we will manage it dynamically, because that's the part of our world which is unpredictable. We never know. We want to be opportunistic and manage it dynamically. It comes out of the work of beyond budgeting, and we applied it inside. Right? That's known. That's knowable. We'll allocate that. We will have 30% of our entire budget. Now, people had conniptions and went into absolute, because you're supposed to allocate everything and then fight every time there's something that comes, right? Because the pattern had always been, but changed the pattern, and they had a much easier life that every time an opportunity came along, there were resources available to allocate. So it's about being able to understand that control is different, changing the conversation about risk, the definition of risk for complexity. Risk is failure is inevitable, but risk is about early detection, excellence and recovery. So if you change it from avoiding risk to detection strategies, that then in the health system has become, in my experience in some of the work we've done in health, changed, not totally, but changed some of the ways in which people were prepared to be able to, particularly in emergency departments. So sometimes it's finding the principle that's the trigger, that's the pain point that's allowed me in. It's not always worked, but it's been trying to find the complexity principle that's the pain point trigger that has opened up a conversation. And then the final thing that for us in this world, I think offers some real promise is that our Indigenous colleagues have endorsed SenseMaker and the complex facilitation processes as the most appropriate decolonised methods that they've ever seen. So
tell me more about that, meaning that it's more in line with the way the universe works, not so much a system works?
And it's more in line with what they believe is appropriate for the way we should engage, that Indigenous and non-Indigenous people should work together. So Complexability now has a partnership with an Indigenous consulting group, Rightways Wandju, and shortly we've done one piece of work creating third space facilitation methods, and there's a major project about to happen here where we've got access to a big piece of land to do regenerative agriculture and a range of things, and that will involve collaborative co-creation and consultative processes with both Indigenous and non-Indigenous groups, and we'll work collaboratively with our Indigenous colleagues using SenseMaker, but also co-created consultative processes. And so they are prepared to say that in terms of non-colonial, non-patronising co-created processes, they're prepared to endorse the complex facilitation approach and sensemaker as appropriate for working with Indigenous communities.
That's absolutely
so. That's a pretty ringing endorsement. Yeah. So
I should think so. Maybe I could seg into the close of something that I think you just alluded to. I mean, it's amazing to me how principles that are universal within studying complexity, it never ceases to amaze me. It always amazes me. It always surprises me how the most unlikely groups come together and can coordinate and direct action together that are synthetically taught to not like each other from social media or tribes or whatever it could be. When we talk about things that are universally true for all of us, it is amazing how you can bring people together, and whether it's in a company, whether it's in a for-profit, not-for-profit, it's a very amazing way to run an organization. And I think the good news is that there's so much opportunity because there's still a lot of companies that need to come over to this way of thinking.
Look, absolutely, and I would think that if there is any way forward out of the kind of mess we've created, it's moving to places and spaces where we find the opportunity to be able to behave differently, collaboratively and collectively.
Yeah. And entropy doesn't care. It applies to us all.
Absolutely.
Viv, we've been delighted to host you. We're glad to know you, and we look forward to doing this again relatively soon, and keep these discussions going. And we'll make sure that we send people your way to Complexability. Maybe also can follow you on LinkedIn, I suppose.
Yes, look, absolutely. And as I say, I would hope that maybe later in the year we'll be able to share something a little more specific around some of the other projects that we're doing.
Wonderful. All right. For the sake of the recording, we'll close. Thanks for listening to No Way Out. And again, Viv Read, thanks for joining us all the way from down under.
My pleasure.
Thanks again.